So as the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a Cold War, the US had some huge successes in the early years in Europe and then had a series of failures in Asia. At the same time, it was going through the greatest economy the world has ever seen. It's called the Golden Age of Capitalism. Following World War II, the United States its economy will experience what is usually considered the greatest period in all of US history, arguably all of human history. Now there's two terms that I'm going to tell you. You don't have to memorize these, but they're just useful to know as we go forward. If you ever have a chance to take a philosophy of logic class, you learn about logical fallacies or errors in people's arguments that will make it so you don't even have to fully understand a subject to know when what someone is telling you is not correct. And when it comes to economics, the monocausal or single cause fallacy, it's also known as causal oversimplification. That is when there is an assumption that an outcome has a single or simple cause. And there's no subject where that is more true than in economics, because there is a lot of factors. The most common monocausal fallacy error that people make when it comes to economics is that presidents control the economy. Don't care which party, don't care what they're doing, presidents do not control the economy. It's not that they don't have an effect on the economy, but there's just so many more factors. Related to the monocausal fallacy, it's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Two psychologists came up with it. It is a cognitive bias that occurs when someone overestimates their ability of knowledge or experience, and it is due because they have limited competence in a certain domain. So it turns out the less someone knows about a subject, the more certain they are that they are correct. And that is true across all sorts of issues. It's important to understand that for talking about the economy of the 1950s and the Golden Age of Capitalism, because we can never reinvent this period. There are good lessons that we can learn from it. There are examples of things that are useful, but it can never be recreated. And so any attempt to recreate the economy of the 1950s, it is just never going to happen. And that is for one very, very good reason. The only reason this could happen is because the world was destroyed. The rest of the world was completely destroyed by World War II. So the United States, it was the overwhelming superpower. It will have about 6% of the world's population at the time, and it will control close to 30% of the world's economy. And it is producing about 50% of all manufactured goods in the world. So it is producing manufactured goods for most manufactured goods in the entire world are coming from just 6% of the population. In the roughly 10 years of the 1950s, the US economy, personal incomes will increase more than the previous 50 years combined. So that can never happen again. However, there are some important lessons that we should get from the Golden Age of Capitalism. And the reason why it is sometimes considered the greatest economy the world's ever seen is because it is the strongest middle class, well, I should say the best economy in U.S. history, because it is the strongest middle class that we've ever had in this country. which means, of course, there's the lowest income inequality. And this is really important because, if you remember, 70% of the U.S. economy is is based on consumers. So when you have low income inequality, you have a lot more people that can buy a lot more stuff. It stimulates the entire economy. So the absolute lowest economic inequality in all of U.S. history, and the highest tax rate in all of U.S. history in a time of peace. Bar none, the tax rate of this period, progressive income tax, was the highest that the U.S. has ever had in a time of peace. The highest rate on the progressive income tax was 91%, which is insanely high. It ranged from 20% to 91% for incomes over $200,000, which is, today it is an unthinkable amount for most people. The corporate tax rate was like 50%. So do not get me wrong. I am not saying raising taxes will solve income inequality, all income inequality issues. However, what it does demonstrate is raising taxes will not destroy the economy. Because again, this is the highest taxes and progressive income tax, corporate taxes in a time of peace. On top of that, this is the golden age of labor unions. Labor unions had been around obviously for a while, but in general, they had not done well for most of U.S. history. If you remember the AFL, American Federation of Labor, it was a very elitist labor union. And then another one, the other biggest one, CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations, that was an industrial organization, just as many workers as possible. The two will unite in 1956 and 1955, and about 33% of all American workers are part of a labor union during this period. So as part of the reason for the low income inequality, again, I'm not saying labor unions are good, because when they get too much power, they will get very corrupt. Just like businesses, just like government, anything that has too much power can get corrupt, and usually does. But this is considered the golden age of labor unions because of the legislation of the New Deal, the Wagner Act. So labor unions will do fantastically well. Also, the veterans of World War II are the best treated veterans in all of U.S. history. The United States government will pass $20 billion, piece of legislation called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, known as the GI Bill, to help soldiers get reintegrated back into society. And it will do this in two ways. First, paying for them to go back to school. The number of servicemen that will go back to school is enormous. And because of the GI Bill, the United States will have the most people going into higher education in its history. And beginning in 1950, the amount of people enrolled in college will double every decade. So in 1950 it was 2 million, 1960 4 million, 1970 8 million. And what this means is two things. One, the U.S. higher education system will become the best in the world. It had been Germany before this, but because of the sheer amount of people going to college, and so the amount of money that is going into higher education, the U.S. will get higher education system becomes the best in the world. And two, having a highly educated population is really good for a U.S. economy, and that is one of the most important things for any economy, especially today, when we live in a knowledge-based economy, vast majority of the U.S. economy is knowledge-based, you need to have a very highly educated population, highly educated workforce. So the U.S. will have an incredibly highly educated workforce, and this does fantastically well for veterans. So that's the first way the GI Bill helps, higher education. Second, homes. Before this, people could get home loans, but home loans were usually, you had to have a big down payment, and they were hard to get. It was much more difficult. What the GI Bill will do is make the federal government the underwriter for home loans for veterans by offering low-interest, long-term loans. So veterans can buy their first houses. And veterans will do this. They will buy 3.5 million homes within the first 10 years of the GI Bill. And construction, as we've talked about before, is always associated with the good economy. Not like China, where they're just building nonsense, but when it's construction for some people need. And there will be a massive boom in home construction during this period, which is a huge factor in the economy doing well. And what we get in the 1950s, it's not brand new in the 1950s, but this is when the suburbs became a big thing. Suburbs have been around before, but 1950s is when it becomes the norm. And a lot of people will start moving into suburbs. Suburbs are outside of major cities. It's not the founder of it, but the person that's considered kind of the godfather of suburbs is a guy named William Levitt. He is to suburban homes what Ford was to cars. Levitt will produce or buys 4,000-acre potato farm outside of New York, and he builds Levittown. There were, you could buy different styles of houses and their different levels, but in general, they were incredibly inexpensive. They were about $8,000 a piece, and you had a few different floor plans to pick from. $8,000 in 2024 would be about $110,000. So it's still relatively cheap. And they were built incredibly fast. It was at the height of it, it was about 150 houses a week. A house was built every 4 hours in Levittown at the height of construction. During the 1950s, people will move to suburban areas in huge numbers. Of the 13 million homes built during this period, about 85% of them are in the suburbs. And the population of the suburbs will just explode. Now, obviously, if you're living in suburbs and you work in the city, you have to get to work somehow. So another factor in the golden age of capitalism is cars. Obviously, cars have been around since cars exploded in the 1920s, but the 1950s is the period when a lot of people consider it the golden age of automobiles in the United States. The amount of cars that people had exploded. The amount of cars in the United States went up, more than tripled. The amount of homes with more than one car more than doubled. In 1950, the United States big three automakers, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, were producing 3/4 of all cars in the entire world. That's why it could only happen because the rest of the world was destroyed. So we can never go back to this, but that is how big U.S. auto manufacturing is. 3/4 of all cars in the world are being produced by 3 major companies in the United States. So automobiles and everything that comes with the construction of automobiles exploded. Now, in order to get from the suburbs into the cities, you need roads. So the government, under Dwight D. Eisenhower, will pass the Interstate Highway Act. The Interstate Highway Act is the largest public works program in all of U.S. history. There was obviously some big ones during the New Deal, but the single largest public construction was during Eisenhower's administration, and it is the interstate highway system. It was $32 billion to create 41,000 miles of interstate highway. And this really made the U.S. economy thrive. Part of the reason, obviously, is because you had to have people construct the roads. They had to buy cement, so it's helping a lot of other industries. But going all the way, the first person to call for an interstate highway system or a national road system was Alexander Hamilton in his report on manufacturers. This was not a new idea. Hamilton had called for it. Henry Clay had called for it with his American system. But having a good transportation system meant that there's going to be more trade. And so this was a huge boom for the U.S. economy in all sorts of ways. Having a reliable infrastructure system is vitally important for any economy. Random, not so fun fact, our transportation system was better in the 1960s than it is in the 2020s, because the infrastructure in the United States is deteriorating incredibly fast. So having a good transportation system was absolutely essential. Now, as businessmen were driving their cars all over the country on these new fancy highways, there was not enough, they needed a way for pay to things, and there was not enough money in circulation. So during, I'm not going to go into the monetary system, it's getting too complicated, but there wasn't enough money in circulation. So in the 1950s, we will get the invention of the credit card. The credit card, if you remember in the 1920s, they invented installment paying, which is a form of credit, but in the 1950s, they will invent the credit card. The very first one was the Diners Club card, and it was meant for wealthy businessmen. And it was so popular that the amount of credit cards will just absolutely explode. Sears, they will invent their own credit card in 1950, and within 10 years, there are more than 10 million Sears credit cards. And so people are now buying all this new stuff with their new credit cards. And obviously, that is a lot of consumer spending that is stimulating the economy. Now, everyone has multiple credit cards, and you can get one from any company pretty much anywhere. But this is the beginning of that. So it encouraged mass consumption, and by the 1960s, the amount of credit card debt was somewhere in the neighborhood. Credit card or personal debt had gone up something like 500% in the span of a decade. So people are buying all sorts of new things. And one of the most popular things they were buying were televisions. Americans bought televisions with those new fancy credit cards in huge numbers, and there is so much that can be said about televisions and the effect of television on society. They could spend weeks on this one topic, but fortunately we don't have time. But the number of people with televisions will explode. So in 1950, there were about 9% of the U.S. population has a television, and by 1960, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 92% of Americans. So it goes from like 1 in 10 to 9 in 10 over the course of a decade. And this is really important for the United States during this period for several reasons. One, it had a homogenizing effect on society. So all of a sudden, people in rural Alabama and New York City now had something in common. They're watching the same shows because there are only 3 channels, NBC, CBS, and ABC. So everyone's watching the same shows, and the shows in the 1950s are pushing the narrative of the Cold War. There's Americans good, American capitalism, democracy good, and Soviets, atheism, socialism bad. And so the people of this generation will be one of the most homogenous generations in U.S. history. And it's not that they all agree, but it is one of the most homogenous generations because they are watching these same things. And those are pushing messages of the Cold War. Second reason this is important is because it led to the explosion of the advertising industry. Advertising industry had been around before, but not television advertising, obviously. And television advertising will become a huge influence on promoting the consumer culture, getting people to buy more and more. And buying stuff becomes a sign of being a good American, because having all this stuff is American, and living in poor, wretched condition, that is a Soviet thing. So the advertising industry will increase, its profits will increase about 400% over the course of the 1950s. And there are tons of examples of it, but just one example, there was a company that was making tents, and it was going to go out of business. And it went to an advertising agency, and one of the most popular shows at the time was Davy Crockett. So they took those same tents, slapped a sticker that said Davy Crockett on the side of it, and boom, then it got bought up. Because now it's not just a tent, it's a Davy Crockett tent. So advertising becomes a massive part in promoting the economy to expand because of more and more consumption. A lot of the advertisements from this period are just blatantly racist. You mean a woman can open it? Don't worry, darling, you didn't burn the beer. If you watch Mad Men, this is the golden age of advertising, of TV advertising. So you now have the advertising industry really exploding. And it was advertising on televisions, obviously, especially to the massive population boom. The baby boomers are the largest and most powerful generation in human history. And I can say that with certainty because it is the largest generation of the most powerful country of the best economy in human history. And I can say a lot about baby boomers. They are a huge generation, and they have essentially dominated everything about the U.S. economy from the time they were born until the present. They still do. During this period, from 1940 to 1955, the population of the United States went up 27%. And remember, we still have those very strict immigration laws from the 1920s, so most of that is new babies. At the height of the baby boom, in 1955, there's a new child born every 15 seconds. So it is a huge amount of children being born. And again, I can't stress this enough. Everything you know about society today is because of this generation. It is the largest, most powerful generation, and they have the most political control of any generation. Part of this was because of having more babies. There were just a lot of babies, but the other reason is because of the invention of antibiotics and penicillin. So one of the byproducts of World War II, antibiotics and penicillin will be responsible for ending childhood diseases that had just decimated children for most of human history, especially whooping cough, measles, and polio. Once the polio vaccine is created in 1955, by 1960, polio is completely gone. Well before COVID was a thing, we actually brought measles back, because anti-vax has been around since well before COVID, and it was out in California. There was a group that believed that all vaccines are bad, and so they brought measles back. So maybe we'll bring polio back. Who knows? Now, there is one thing that pulls together all of the things I am talking about. Every one of those individual factors, all those individual factors that helped contribute to the Golden Age of Capitalism, and can all be summarized can all be pulled together in one thing: Disneyland. Disneyland, obviously the brainchild of Walt Disney, opened its doors in 1955, and it was absolutely quintessential the United States in the 1950s. Walt Disney, it took about a year to build, and cost about $17 million at the time to build, and in its first 6 months alone, it will have more than 1 million visitors. So how does it represent everything we just talked about? Well, for one, being able to go to something like this, you need to have people with money, so you need to have a middle class. Also, one thing that labor unions did is got time off of work. So that helped in allowing more people to come. It was a massive, massive construction project. $17 million over 1 year, which for the size, that is very, very fast. Someone asked Walt Disney, how exactly did you build that in just 1 year? He said, easy, I hired everyone in California. So obviously, construction is just a huge part of this. The suburbs, it was specifically built in the suburbs of California, so families would have easy access to it. So of those, pulls together the suburbs and home construction that was taking place. In the first 6 months, as I mentioned, more than 1 million people will visit Walt Disney or Disneyland, and about 60% of them lived in California. How did the other 40% even hear about it? Advertising. On the news. Children's shows. Kids are watching cartoons, and all of a sudden an advertisement comes on for Disneyland. They go running to their parents, let's go to Disneyland. How did they get there from out of state? Those new fancy highways in those new fancy cars, using their new fancy credit cards. So nothing represents the United States and how well the United States was doing better than Disneyland. Definitely don't have to know this, but when the Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, came to the United States in 1959, he had 2 requests. He said, I want to meet John Wayne, and I want to go to Disneyland. Well, when John Wayne was told Nikita Khrushchev wants to meet him, I will let you guess how he responded, and it was much more colorful than just no. In terms of going to Disneyland, the U.S. government actually looked into it. The Secret Service looked into it, and it turns out there is no possible way to let the Soviet premier go to Disneyland and guarantee his safety. Even if they closed down the park, didn't let anyone in, there are still too many places where snipers could be, and it would just be impossible to guarantee his safety. And there could be no bigger disaster than the Soviet premier being assassinated in the United States. As the story goes, Nikita Khrushchev is staying at a hotel, and Secret Service agents come to his hotel, and they tell him, Premier Khrushchev, unfortunately, you cannot go to Disneyland. We won't be able to guarantee your safety, and we cannot risk it. Khrushchev says, okay. Turns around, walks in his room, and according to the stories, you just hear smashing, there's crashing, there's like vases being thrown, there's dishes being smashed. Supposedly, people that came into his room later, he had trashed it, overthrown the beds, destroyed everything in sight because he wanted to go to Disneyland so bad. He had a little baby fit. So the U.S. economy was doing absolutely phenomenally well, and that is the golden age of capitalism.